In a small town plagued by poverty, Gideon Kane and his wife, Liora, seem to have accepted their fate. But when Ronan Creed, a wealthy and charming man, appears, Gideon sees a way out of his dead-end life. With an elaborate plan to fake his own death, he leaves his poor wife behind to start a life of luxury with Ronan. But, in the darkness of lies, can betrayal truly bring freedom? Or is it just the beginning of a nightmare with no way out? Gideon and Liora Kane's house was at the end of a dusty dirt road far from the center of town. The roof was old, with long cracks running along the walls, and the ground was uneven when it rained. The night wind always crept in through the cracked windows, creating a whistling sound that was a reminder of the inevitable deterioration of the place. When it rained, water seeped through the ceiling, dripping steadily onto the floor, making the house cold and damp. Gideon would spend hours trying to patch up each patch of roof, but his efforts lasted only a few days before the roof leaked again. Liora, his loyal and gentle wife, was patient. She did not complain, did not blame, but Gideon could see the weariness in her eyes every time they sat down to a simple dinner. Sometimes it was just bread and water, sometimes a few boiled eggs. That was all they could afford that week. Gideon looked at his wife, feeling a pang in his heart knowing that he could not give her a better life. His helplessness weighed on him like a shackle around his neck. Gideon worked as a freelance handyman with unstable work and an uncertain income. On days when he had no work, he wandered the town, hoping someone would need help. But often he was met with head shakes, gentle rejections, or cold stares. Each penny he earned from odd jobs barely covered the utility bills and a little food for the couple. Every time he saw Liora's worried eyes as she checked her empty wallet, Gideon felt his heart break. He knew he needed to do more, but opportunities seemed to slam shut in his face. Poverty was like a dark shadow, making him feel cornered with no way out. There were nights when Gideon lay awake, lying in his old bed, listening to the wind howling through the cracks in the door. He lay next to Liora, watching her face in her sleep, wondering how he could escape this. The stress and anxiety about money, about the future, weighed heavily on his shoulders. Many times Gideon thought about giving it all up, leaving this house and running away from reality. But he knew Liora would never leave him. She was all he had. Yet a deep part of Gideon yearned for a way out. Just when Gideon felt himself sinking into despair, Ronan appeared. Ronan was a wealthy man, living in a modern but lonely house. Despite having everything that others wanted, money, status, he still felt empty. Every night he sat alone in his cold house, lacking warmth and connection with others. On the outside, Ronan appeared successful, but on the inside he longed for a real relationship, someone who could understand his loneliness. When Gideon received a call from Ronan asking him to come fix the electrical system in his house, he did not expect that this meeting would change his life. Gideon walked into the large and luxurious house, feeling like he was entering another world. Every corner of the house exuded modernity and sophistication, something Gideon had never experienced in his struggling life. From the very first moment, Ronan gave Gideon a strange feeling, not just as a customer, but as someone who seemed to open a new path. Ronan greeted Gideon with a warm smile, offering him a cup of hot coffee. Ronan's comfort and friendliness immediately put Gideon at ease, unlike the cold, indifferent customers he had encountered before. While repairing the electrical system, Gideon couldn't help but look at everything around him, the house with its modern amenities, its meticulously designed and elegant interior. He saw the contrast between Ronan's life and his own. On one side was the financial burden, the poverty surrounding him. On the other side was Ronan's freedom, his carefree demeanor. This made Gideon yearn for something different, a life he had never dared to think of. After work was over, Ronan didn't rush to ask Gideon to leave. Instead, he invited Gideon to sit down and talk. That was the moment that started a relationship that neither of them could have expected. At first, the meeting was simply a discussion about life, work, and normal things. But the more they talked, the more Gideon realized that Ronan was different from other people. He didn't just ask random questions, but really listened and cared about what Gideon said. Ronan shared about his life, a seemingly perfect life, full of material things but lacking in connection. Despite living in a luxurious house, Ronan still felt lonely. This made a strong impression on Gideon because he realized that not everything was as perfect as it appeared. In Ronan's loneliness, Gideon saw a reflection of his own emptiness. Gideon couldn't deny that Ronan's attraction grew stronger with each meeting. Their conversations became deeper, no longer superficial stories about work but sharing feelings, about deep concerns. Gideon found comfort in Ronan, someone he could confide in without fear of judgment. Ronan not only gave Gideon a sense of freedom of spirit, but his presence also had a vague attraction that Gideon had never experienced before. Their closeness was no longer just a casual handshake, but every time Ronan lightly touched Gideon's shoulder, he felt a stimulation, a strong current of emotion running through his body. The closer Gideon got to Ronan, the more he felt drawn into his world. Instead of just meeting for work, Gideon began to find excuses to come back to Ronan's house more often, from fixing small problems to meeting up just to chat. Every time he entered Ronan's house, Gideon felt freed from the burdens of life. Everything there exuded the freedom that Gideon craved, from the luxury of the house to Ronan's calm demeanor. The attraction between the two was no longer just sympathy, but had surpassed the boundaries of normal friendship. Gideon began to realize that he not only admired Ronan's life, but was also attracted to him mentally and physically. Their conversations were no longer just words, but every gesture and look between the two became full of meaning. Gideon knew he was on the brink of a decision from which there was no turning back, but he couldn't stop himself. Despite his relationship with Ronan, Gideon still couldn't stop thinking about Liora every time he returned home and saw his wife, the gentle woman who had always been by his side. Gideon felt guilty. He knew that he was betraying Liora not only emotionally but also in loyalty, but his growing feelings for Ronan made him unable to control himself. The struggle between his responsibility to Liora and his intense desire for Ronan kept Gideon awake night after night. He knew that he was facing an irreversible choice, but every time he thought about his dead-end life with Liora, he wanted to give up everything and immerse himself in the free world with Ronan. Gideon and Ronan's relationship reached its climax one hot summer night. After drinking a few beers with Ronan, Gideon clearly felt that he could no longer pretend. The tension between them was like a tight rope, ready to snap at any moment. Gideon sat there, looking at Ronan under the dim light, and in that moment, all his defenses collapsed. Gideon decided to let go of everything, to let all his pent-up emotions be released. Ronan, as if he had noticed Gideon's inner struggle, approached and gently touched his shoulder. In that moment, all the resistance in Gideon's heart melted away. He knew that he had gone too far to turn back. The kiss between the two was not only an explosion of suppressed emotions, but also a sign of a new life, full of danger and sin. After the fateful night with Ronan, Gideon returned home and realized that everything had changed. Before, the shabby house with its cracks and cold walls had made him feel helpless, but now it was like an invisible prison. Every time he looked at Liora, the wife he once loved, he felt a heavy burden of guilt on his mind. Gideon could not deny the betrayal he had caused, but at the same time, he could not control his desire for Ronan every time he was with Ronan. Gideon felt like he was living in another world, a free, unconstrained world, where he could shed all the responsibilities and burdens that life with Liora brought. Ronan not only brought him comfort, but also a release from his poor, boring, and dead-end life. However, when he returned home with Liora, everything became suffocating. There were silent dinners where Liora tried to smile even though Gideon knew the worry in her eyes. She had no idea of her husband's double life and had always trusted his devotion. But Gideon could no longer find comfort in her love as he had before. The heaviness, the guilt, and the conflict between two worlds made Gideon increasingly silent. Gideon gradually realized that he could not live like this forever, two lives, two opposing selves. He tried to maintain the image of a good husband, but every time he looked at Liora, he felt his heart torn apart. Gideon himself had become a different person, no longer a devoted family man, but a liar living a double life. Gideon's internal struggle became more and more evident as he realized that there was no escape from his current life. During the day, he still had to face Liora with heavy family responsibilities. But at night, when he met Ronan, all the burdens seemed to disappear. He lived two completely opposite lives, and that made him feel like he was losing control. Every night, Gideon tossed and turned in his sleep, wondering if there was any way out for him from this internal conflict. Every time he saw Liora, his faithful wife who had always loved him, he felt more guilty than ever. But on the other hand, the moments of freedom with Ronan made him feel like he could be himself again. He couldn't let go of Ronan, but he also couldn't face the betrayal he had caused Liora. Gideon finds himself increasingly isolated from his own life. He cannot share his true feelings with Liora, nor can he completely escape his family responsibilities. Although he tries to appear a hard-working, devoted husband on the outside, on the inside, Gideon's mind is increasingly troubled. Sleepless nights become more frequent as he dwells on the double life he is leading. He knows that if he continues like this, one day the truth will be revealed and everything will collapse. The fatigue and anxiety weigh on Gideon more and more, making it impossible for him to focus on work or family life. Even when he is with Ronan, The fear of being discovered begins to creep into his mind. Gideon knows that he cannot continue living like this forever, but he cannot find a way out. Amidst this struggle and uncertainty, the idea of faking his own death began to form in Gideon's mind. At first, it was only a passing thought, but as the days passed, it began to make more sense. Gideon began to imagine a new life, one where he could escape it all, no more dealing with Liora and his family responsibilities, no more living with the guilt. Faking his own death seemed like the only way he could start over, without having to deal with the consequences of his previous decisions. The idea initially stunned Gideon. He knew it wouldn't be an easy decision, and a part of him still felt guilty about abandoning Liora, but as time went on, the prospect of being freed from his current life became more and more appealing. He could start over with Ronan, where no one knew about his past, and where he could be himself. Ronan, sensing Gideon's weariness and insecurity, began to convince him that this was the only way they could be together without worrying about the past. Ronan told Gideon that he deserved a better life, not having to endure the deadlock and poverty of life with Liora. Ronan's persuasion, combined with a growing sense of despair, pushed Gideon to his final decision. One night, after returning home and seeing Liora sitting at the dining table with empty eyes, Gideon knew that he could not continue like this. The silence between the two was too heavy, and the suffocation of family life pushed Gideon to the brink. In that moment, he knew that there was no turning back. Gideon decided to carry out a plan to fake his own death, to end all burdens and start a new life with Ronan. After making the decision to fake his own death to escape his life with Liora, Gideon knew he needed to plan meticulously and leave no trace. He spent weeks preparing, calculating every little detail. He knew that if one small slip-up happened, everything could fall apart and the plan would fail. First, Gideon began by creating a picture of himself as a man in a state of mental breakdown, in a desperate situation. He deliberately left behind signs of crisis, unpaid bills, a nearly empty bank account, and visits to a psychiatrist. These helped to build an image of a man who was both physically and mentally exhausted, preparing for an inevitable collapse. He also deliberately created signs of instability in his home life, such as being constantly tired, having trouble sleeping, and falling into a state of deep thought. Not only does this create a plausible reason for him to disappear, it also helps people, especially Liora, believe that he had an accident or committed suicide in a moment of despair. Gideon knew that to fake his death convincingly, he needed to choose a place that was completely remote, where no one would be able to find him immediately. The weekend trip that Liora had proposed now became the perfect setting for his act. The wild, rugged, and sparsely traveled mountains would be where he would carry out his escape plan. Gideon agreed to go on a long-awaited weekend getaway with Liora. Throughout the trip, he tried to maintain a calm demeanor, as if this was just a normal, relaxing trip. But inside, Gideon's emotions were building and his tension was rising. He knew that this would be the last time he would see Liora. When they reached the top of the mountain, Gideon prepared for the decisive moment. The deserted trail he had chosen was the perfect place to stage an accident. Gideon pretended to slip and fall down a steep cliff. With a series of carefully calculated movements, he rolled down the ledge, choosing a position where, from Liora's perspective, he had completely disappeared from sight. Liora screamed, her screams echoing through the silence of the mountain. She rushed to the edge, but Gideon was nowhere to be seen. In her mind, the image of her beloved husband falling into the abyss, with no chance of survival. As Liora panicked and called for help, Gideon hid under a narrow ledge, trying to stay silent. Liora's cries echoed from above, each sob tearing through the quiet space. In that moment, Gideon felt the torment inside him. He had abandoned the woman who loved and trusted him. But he knew that this was the last step he had to take to have the life he had always wanted. Liora called for help, but with the rugged terrain and the wild mountains, any help came too late. By the time the rescue team arrived, Gideon had completely disappeared. There was no trace of him alive, and everyone believed that Gideon had died in a tragic accident. Gideon was prepared for anything. After rolling down the ledge, he carefully crawled into a narrow ravine he had discovered earlier on his expeditions. He lay there for hours, waiting for darkness to fall and the search by rescue teams to cease. During the wait, Gideon relived the life he had decided to leave behind, the moments with Liora, their final conversations, and her anguished cries as he disappeared. When night fell completely, Gideon quietly left his hiding place. He had prepared himself for his disappearance, carrying a bag of clothes and the necessities to start a new life. He walked along the dark trail, weighed down by conflicting emotions. Part of him felt relief at having escaped successfully, but another part was tormented by guilt for leaving Liora in pain and panic. Gideon did not look back. His old life with all its poverty and responsibilities was now over. After his perfect plan to fake his death succeeded, Gideon left his old life behind and started a new life with a false identity. With Ronan, they chose another city, far away from where Gideon and Liora used to live, where no one knew about his past. The modern, warm house that Ronan chose for the two of them seemed to be the paradise that Gideon had always longed for. No longer burdened by money, no longer worried about family responsibilities, life with Ronan was filled with comfort and freedom. At first, this brought Gideon a feeling of great relief. Gideon enjoyed the comforts that he had never dreamed of before. Luxurious dinners, parties, and lavish trips became part of their lives. To Gideon, this seemed like a perfect new life, where he did not have to face his painful past and heavy responsibilities. He felt that he had done the right thing, that this life was what he deserved after all his years of hard work. However, this happiness did not last forever. After the first months of enjoying his freedom, a feeling of unease began to creep into Gideon's mind. At first, it was just a fleeting worry, thoughts about whether his plan to fake his death would be discovered. Every time he saw a policeman or heard the doorbell, Gideon felt his heart pounding, afraid that someone had discovered the truth. Despite his comfort and freedom, Gideon could not escape the obsession with Liora and the past he had left behind. Every night, lying next to Ronan, he would wake up startled by nightmares. The image of Liora in a panic when he disappeared would always appear clearly in his mind, drowning him in guilt. Even though he had left Liora behind, he could not escape the ghost of betrayal and the pain he had caused her. Ronan, who had hoped that Gideon's new life would bring him peace, began to notice a change in Gideon. Their quiet evenings became more and more painful as Gideon became more withdrawn and distant. Gideon's anxiety and stress became more and more evident, and this began to affect his relationship with Ronan, although Gideon tried to hide it. His fear and guilt became more and more overwhelming, making him feel like he was living in a psychological prison. Meanwhile, Liora was still in the throes of her loss. However, after a while, vague feelings and doubts began to rise in her heart. Although everyone believed that Gideon had died in a tragic accident, Liora could not help but feel that something was wrong. The small details of Gideon's death, the way he had acted before the trip, the changes in his behavior, all made Liora feel that something was wrong. Liora began to look for clues, quietly investigating without telling anyone. She rummaged through Gideon's papers, checked his financial information, and discovered that there were many irregularities. The missing money, the vague notes about seeing a psychiatrist, all of these did not match the image of the husband she had known. The feeling of doubt grew, urging Liora to continue investigating. Liora couldn't accept that Gideon had disappeared without a trace. She began to follow the small clues, searching for information through the sources she knew. After weeks of investigation, Liora discovered a suspicious clue, a financial transaction that appeared in an unfamiliar city, a place Gideon would have no reason to go if he were alive. Gradually, the picture of Gideon's deception began to form in her mind. Liora decided not to stop. She would continue until she found the truth. Ronan, who once brought Gideon comfort, now became a source of stress. Gideon could no longer enjoy his new life as before, but instead was filled with fear of being discovered and haunted by the past. Every time he saw Ronan, Gideon felt like he was cheating not only Liora, but also the man he had chosen to start his life over with. Gideon and Ronan's relationship gradually became cold. Their conversations became less frequent, and every time Gideon tried to forget his worries, he was pulled back by his obsession with Liora. The sense of freedom Gideon once felt was completely gone, replaced by fear and anxiety about being discovered. Liora, after weeks of searching and investigating, finally tracked Gideon to the city where he was hiding. She couldn't believe what she found. Gideon, the husband she loved, the one she believed was dead, was alive and starting a new life with someone else. Feelings of anger, pain, and betrayal surged through Liora. She decided to confront Gideon and make him answer for everything he had done. When Liora appeared at Gideon and Ronan's door, Gideon's heart stopped. He couldn't believe his eyes. The woman he had abandoned, the woman he had faked his own death to escape, was now standing before him, eyes filled with anger and determination. Liora's appearance was not only a shock, but also a real threat to Gideon's new life. Everything he's built, from his fake identity to his relationship with Ronan, could now be shattered in the blink of an eye. Liora entered the house, her face filled with anger and despair. She could no longer contain her emotions. She blamed Gideon for his betrayal, for faking his death and leaving her in a panic. She demanded an explanation, demanded that he answer for everything he had done. But instead of feeling guilty and sorry, Gideon felt only one thing: panic. Liora's every word was like a knife stabbing into Gideon's mind, reminding him of all his mistakes and sins. He knew that if Liora revealed the truth, everything would end. His relationship with Ronan would be ruined, and he would face punishment. Gideon felt like he was being pushed into a corner, with no other choice. The tension in the room grew heavier. Liora continued to question Gideon, demanding answers for everything he had done. Gideon stood there, speechless, as every emotion and worry rushed through his mind. He knew this was the defining moment. Either he could keep this secret forever, or it would all be lost. In a panic, Gideon felt himself losing control. He looked at Liora, who was pushing him into a dead end, and the fear in his heart turned into action. Gideon knew that if he let Liora live, she would reveal the truth and he would lose everything. The only thing left for him now was to silence Liora forever. No longer thinking clearly, Gideon rushed to the kitchen, grabbing a sharp knife. He approached Liora, his hands shaking but his eyes showing utter despair. Liora, realizing the danger, tried to back away, but it was too late. Gideon, in a moment of loss of control, swung the knife down. Liora screamed in pain and horror, but her screams were quickly silenced by the cold blade. Blood soaked into Gideon's hands, and he stood there, looking down at the lifeless body of his once beloved wife. Liora's screams echoed throughout the house, but were quickly drowned out by the silence. In that moment, Gideon realized there was no turning back. He had killed Liora, not just to protect his secret, but to protect the false life he had tried to build. But now, as Liora's blood soaked into his hands, Gideon realized he had lost everything, not just his new life, but his humanity. After killing Liora, Gideon stood there shaking and exhausted. Everything he had fought to protect was now meaningless. His new life with Ronan, the freedom he had yearned for, was now a shattered dream. Gideon looked down at Liora's lifeless body and realized that he had crossed the line of no return. The crime he had committed was not simply a betrayal, but now an unforgivable crime. Every feeling of guilt and fear Gideon had ever felt came rushing back. His self-justification, that he deserved a new life, was now empty and meaningless. There was nothing that could justify his murder, and nothing that could salvage the situation. Gideon realized that he had lost everything, including himself. Ronan, who had been in the next room, heard Liora scream and entered. He saw Gideon standing there, a bloody knife in his hand, and Liora's lifeless body at his feet. Ronan couldn't believe his eyes. The man he loved, the man he had helped escape his past, was now a murderer. Ronan backed away, his eyes filled with horror and pain. Gideon's life was falling apart now. There was nothing left for him to run to, nowhere to hide his crimes. He had lost everything: the wife he had loved, his new life with Ronan, and himself.